Well, Prime Minister Mark Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith are reportedly getting closer to a deal on Alberta's energy sector, and that could include a plan for an oil pipeline. Now, Premier Smith says a pipeline to BC's northwest coast is essential for Canada's energy future. However, BC Premier David Eby has repeatedly said that is not going to happen. He has raised concerns about the environmental risks, coastal tanker traffic, and the rights of Indigenous nations along the route. And all of that begs the question, is a pipeline deal politically or legally even possible? Well, to talk about that, we're joined by Jeff Nicholls. He's an Indigenous rights lawyer with Ratcliffe LLP in North Vancouver, also a member of the Lakwalams First Nation. Good morning to you.
Hi, good morning, Stephen. Thanks so much for having me on.
Oh, thanks for being here. This debate dragged on for months between the premiers of BC and Alberta. What do you make of it?
Well, I think that obviously we've seen this type of thing before. It's not the first time that British Columbia and Canada has gone through this kind of pipeline politics, I guess. We saw it with the Enbridge Northern Gateway project, and the approval was overturned because of issues related to Indigenous rights. And then, of course, we have the Trans Mountain expansion project, which many of your listeners will know and be familiar with, and all of the complexity that ensued there. And it was also overturned, later approved, but it was overturned in court because of consultation issues. So a future proposal would likely face similar challenges in respect of consultation. Obviously, First Nations aren't unitary. They have different views. Some may support it. Some would likely oppose it. But in any event, there would need to be a robust process to understand the impacts of such a proposal.
Eby has dismissed Alberta's pipeline proposal. He's been calling it fictional. It's not a real thing, he says. He says there's no proponent, there's no route, there's no private funding. And he's also warning that it could leave taxpayers on the hook, as the Trans Mountain pipeline did, which was purchased for about $5 or $6 billion and ended up costing more than $30 billion for the expansion. Smith has called Eby's stance un-Canadian and unconstitutional, and she says interprovincial pipelines fall under federal jurisdiction. So at the most basic level, who is it going to be up to approve this one way or the other?
Yeah, well, without getting into politics, right now, because of the scope of a proposed pipeline, and again, as you mentioned, kind of details are lacking, but from the very basic things that are floating around, it would be a very large pipeline, obviously, from Alberta to British Columbia's coast. And so that would trigger an impact assessment under Canada's Impact Assessment Agency. It would be supported by Canada's energy regulator, and it would be a very complex process that would... Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no. Well, I'm just wondering because, again, I imagine that First Nations will be watching this are watching it now already, especially coastal First Nations who have said no way, no how is a pipeline going to terminate there.
Yeah, and so obviously First Nations perspectives are essential in this, and so their views would need to be captured through their own jurisdiction and laws. First Nations have their own legal orders; they have rights under Canada's Constitution. They have their own governments, right? And so their perspectives would be essential in this as well, in addition to the federal government and the province and other kind of layers of government.
British Columbia has adopted UNDRIP into law, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Practically speaking, does that change the approval process at all?
Absolutely, yeah. So that's one of the key, I guess, changes since the last time this was occurred with Trans Mountain. Now we have UNDRIP's adoption, and in addition, as you mentioned, to British Columbia's approval and adoption of UNDRIP, Canada also has the UNDRIP Implementation Act, and that informs the duty to consult, and it also informs any powers under statute. Right, that UNDRIP Implementation Act provides that Canada make its laws consistent with UNDRIP, and of course, the Impact Assessment Agency, the Canada regulator. When we're talking about this regulatory framework, that must be consistent with UNDRIP. And so when I see some things floating around about fast-tracked processes or doing things quickly, I was thinking it's like building a ship in the bottle in 5 minutes. It's like the odds of kind of doing a complicated thing very quickly increases the likelihood of
mistakes.
Making it doesn't bode well for ensuring that First Nations perspectives are adequately considered when things are kind of fast-tracked, and that's part of the uncertainty right now is that we don't know under these kind of fast track these new processes, how First Nations interests will be considered. And of course, they're required to be considered under the Constitution. And so, we're going to have to deal with that.
But we've seen former Minister of Natural Resources Jonathan Wilkinson, who represents North Vancouver, saying that it's going to need buy-in from Indigenous people, but that doesn't need to be unanimous.
Yeah, as I mentioned, First Nations have varying perspectives. So inevitably, there may be some First Nations that would support such a proposal, and there would be First Nations that would likely oppose such a proposal. So, that's up to the nations themselves. But as we've seen, as you mentioned, right, there's many First Nations that really want to make sure that their rights are recognized, and
Yes.
so. That would need to occur in respect to this proposal.
Are things different now than they were during the Northern Gateway debate? Because, we have our trading relationship with the United States is absolutely dead in the water at this moment. Canada looking for markets abroad for everything we produce, including oil. Does that bring more people on side, do you think?
The thing that comes to mind in respect of kind of the Canada-U.S. relationship is a statement that Prime Minister Mark Carney recently made around, what makes us different from the United States. And he kind of quipped that it was the rule of law, and it kind of made a bit of a splash around that. And I think that that's poignant when we think about this very complex regulatory framework and First Nations interests and all that would inure to making such a proposal happen. We need to follow the rule of law, and often, and it's regrettable still that it's First Nations interests that often fall by the wayside in some of these processes, and that violates the rule of law because, of course. As we just mentioned, we just discussed a whole bunch of laws that provide for,
Right.
First Nations consent, First Nations interests. And so, if we were to, as a country, ignore those, then it would be kind of derogating on that rule of law.
We do have the One Canadian Economy Act, however, Bill C-5, which technically, could allow tankers associated with the pipeline to bypass the current moratorium.
Yeah, so I would just say to that First Nations interests and First Nations rights and title and self-government are rooted in the Constitution. And so, the actions we take as a country need to be consistent with the Constitution. And that moratorium is in place for a reason, in part, to protect First Nations rights and title interests. And so, seeking an exemption to a ban, like a ban on tankers that allows tankers is not a ban at all. And so, we would need to see how that plays out.
Jeff, great to see you this morning. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you very much for having me.
Really appreciate it. Jeff Nicholls, Indigenous Rights Lawyer with Ratcliffe LLP in North Vancouver and a member of the Lac Whillams First Nation. And he's with us here in studio this morning.